The mystery of the lost city Atlantis has captivated the imagination of poets, scholars, archaeologists, geologists, occultists, and travelers for over 2,000 years. The idea of an extremely advanced island civilization that emerged in the earliest times of ancient history and disappeared overnight due to a great natural disaster has led believers in the historical reality of the Atlantis story to search for the remnants of this once great civilization all around the world. According to many archaeologists, the Atlantis story is nothing more than a fable with no historical value. On the other hand, occultists approach the Atlantis story, believing it represents a lost spiritual land or viewing it as a clear reality. What is the reason behind the various interpretations of Atlantis, and could there be any truth behind this story? The primary source of all information about Atlantis is the two short dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written by the Greek philosopher Plato during the period of 359 to 347 BC. The source that Plato presumably based his Atlantis story on is Solon, a famous Athenian lawmaker and poet, who was a distant relative of his. Solon heard the story during his visit to the palace of Amasis, the ancient Egyptian king of the Nile Delta's western tip, in the period between 569 to 525 BC. While in Amasis's palace, Solon visited the Temple of Neith and had a conversation with a priest who told him the story of Atlantis. The priest described an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules that existed 9,000 years ago, larger than the combined size of Libya and Asia, ruled by an alliance established by kings descended from the god of the sea and earthquakes, Poseidon. The island and the surrounding ocean were named after Poseidon's eldest son, Atlas. The Atlanteans had an empire extending from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, south to Egypt, and north to Italy. Their attempts to expand further in the Mediterranean led to a confrontation with European powers led by the city-state of Athens, which was then ruled by a warrior elite disdaining wealth and living a simple life. After their allies abandoned them, the Atlantean armies faced defeat at the hands of the Athenians, who continued to fight alone. However, shortly after this victory, an incredibly destructive earthquake and subsequent catastrophic floods occurred, and the lands of Atlantis were submerged into the depths of the ocean, disappearing, in Plato's words, in a dreadful day and night. While Plato provided a more detailed account of the physical and political structure of the island, his dialogues describe the destruction of Atlantis and the sinking of the Pillars of Hercules. In the beginning, Atlantis was a magnificent place with abundant natural resources, forests, fruits, wild animals, and numerous metal ores. Each king on the island had his own royal city, enjoying unlimited dominion, but the capital, ruled by the descendants of Atlas, was the most splendid among them. This ancient metropolis was surrounded by three concentric water circles separated by land masses with defensive walls built for the city's protection. Each of these walls was covered with different metals. The outer one with bronze, the middle one with tin, and the inner wall gleamed with the red light of an unknown metal called orichalcum. The Atlanteans dug a canal through the circular trenches, connecting the center to the sea. They also constructed a harbor by carving the rock walls of the outer trench. The main temple in the central citadel, the Temple of Poseidon, was 3 times larger than the Parthenon in Athens and entirely covered in silver, except for the gold-covered peaks of the towers. The temple's ceiling was adorned with ivory, and the walls, columns, and the temple's floor were adorned with gold, silver, and orichalcum. Additionally, inside the temple, there were many gold statues, including one depicting Poseidon driving a chariot with 6 winged horses. This particular statue was so colossal that the head of the god Poseidon touched the ceiling, which stood at a height of 116 meters. All ancient sources about the lost city Atlantis emerged after Plato and are investigations that go no further than being exciting inquiries into the beliefs of ancient people about Atlantis. In the 4th century BC, Theophrastus, a student of Aristotle, mentioned Atlantis colonies, but unfortunately, a significant portion of his work has been lost. Proclus, in the 5th century AD, asserted the reality of Atlantis in his evaluations of Plato's dialogues, stating that the Atlanteans ruled over all the islands in the Atlantic Ocean for ages. Proclus also tells us that Crantor, the first person to interpret Plato's works in the 4th century BC, visited Say in Egypt and saw a golden column with hieroglyphs narrating the history of Atlantis. In the 2nd century AD, the Roman writer Claudius Aelianus mentioned Atlantis in his work, On the Nature of Animals, referring to it as a massive ancient city known in the traditions of the Phoenicians located on the southwest coast of Spain. The Atlantis legend remained largely obscure for centuries until its revival in the 19th century. The serious research into the mythical island began with the publication of Ignatius Donnelly's work, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, in 1882. Donnelly claimed that all known ancient civilizations derived from the Lost Island, directly adopting Plato's accounts about Atlantis. In those years, Madame Helena Blavatsky, one of the founders of the Theosophical Society and a prominent leader in the growing occult movement, became interested in the idea of lost islands such as Atlantis and Lemuria. Blavatsky frequently mentioned Atlantis in her first work, Unveiled Mysteries, written in 1877. It seems that Madame Blavatsky's extensive work, The Secret Doctrine, is based on a mystical work called the Zion Book, allegedly written in Atlantis. In The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky provides detailed descriptions of Atlantis and its people, discussing advanced technologies, ancient flying machines, giants, and supernatural powers. Some of the gruesome content in Blavatsky's descriptions could significantly influence Atlantis theorists, but her lost city appears to be more of a spiritual place, quite distinct from Donnelly's physically asserted island. In the early 20th century, world-renowned medium Edgar Cayce conducted numerous reading sessions, including Atlantis. Cayce believed Atlantis was an advanced civilization with ships and planes and operated with mysterious energy crystals. He predicted that a part of Atlantis would be found in the Bimini region near the Bahamas in 1968 or 1969. In September 1968, a half-mile limestone block, known today as the Bimini Road, was discovered off North Bimini, and many believed it to be the remnants of the lost Atlantis. However, in 1980, Eugene Shin from the U.S. Geological Survey published results of his examinations of submerged stones in Bimini, revealing different realities than previously thought. The results showed that the blocks had settled there naturally. Radiocarbon data obtained from seashells embedded in the stones indicated a construction date for the road between 1200 BC and 300 BC, much later than the proposed dates for Atlantis. Many researchers, following ancient writers' accounts, identified the Mid-Atlantic Ridge as the remnants of the lost city and searched for Atlantis in the Mid-Atlantic. With the emergence of the theory of continental drift, geologists have considered the possibility of a large island in the Atlantic. Nevertheless, plate tectonics is still a theory, so believers in the existence of a lost island in the Atlantic will continue their research until its reality is proven. Researchers suggest that if the island is in the mid-Atlantic, the Azores archipelago, located in the middle of a submerged mountain range, could be the remnants of the lost city. Different segments also add possibilities for Madeira, the Canary Islands, and the Cape Verde Islands, but to date, no trace of a lost civilization has been found in these lands. Without exception, every year headlines proclaiming "Atlantis found" make their way into newspapers. In reality, assumptions about the location of Atlantis are incredibly numerous. The idea that the Minoan civilization, which thrived in Crete during the Late Bronze Age, indirectly influenced Plato's Atlantis, supposedly destroyed in a massive earthquake in the nearby island of Thera, has been widespread for a long time. However, research on the Late Bronze Age in Crete has revealed that the Minoan civilization continued to develop long after the Thera earthquake. Other potential locations proposed in Europe and the Mediterranean include Ireland, England, Finland, Helgoland Island off the northwest coast of Germany, Andalusia in southern Spain, Spartel Island in the Strait of Gibraltar, Sardinia, Malta, the city of Helike in Greece, a region between Cyprus and Syria in the Mediterranean, Israel, Troy and Tantalus in northwest Turkey. Locations from other parts of the world, such as the Black Sea, India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Bolivia, French Polynesia, the Caribbean, and Antarctica, have also been suggested as possible sites for the lost city. The existence of so many different theories has increased skepticism among many researchers who believe that Plato's Atlantis is nothing more than a political metaphor designed to glorify Athens as a perfect state fighting against the fallen and greedy Atlantis Empire. For them, the story begins and ends with Plato. They doubt the authenticity of the tale where Solon visited Egypt and heard the story from a priest in Say. According to these researchers, Plato's claim that Atlantis is beyond the Pillars of Hercules is merely due to the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean representing the known limits of the world in the famous philosopher's time. Even though Atlantis is not mentioned in pre-Platonic literary works, the Greek historian Herodotus mentioned in his Histories that Solon received some laws from Amasis in Say, Egypt, referencing this story. This implies that Solon was in Egypt at the time Plato mentioned. From Plato's writings, it is clear that he aimed to convey political and philosophical ideas, emphasizing that wealth and power alone are not enough to overcome a well-organized and well-governed society like Athens. To make his assumptions more intriguing, he might have added details such as a catastrophic destruction to mimic real events. Thus, the famous philosopher didn't need to look too far for inspiration. In the summer of 426 BC, one of the most devastating earthquakes in ancient history struck Greece just north of Athens. The ensuing tsunami, following this major earthquake, caused significant damage to the northern coast of Athens, destroying part of an island named Atalante. In 373 BC, a destructive earthquake and tsunami wiped out the wealthy Greek city of Helike on the southern coast of Corinth Gulf on the Greek mainland. Helike was known as the city of Poseidon, and its sacred forest was also there. Certainly, there are connections between these earthquakes and the destruction of Plato's Atlantis, illustrating that the famous philosopher depicted the recent history of his country in his story. However, if Plato aimed to present his ideas by portraying the recent history of Greece at that time, the events between those earthquakes and the demise of Atlantis, there is a correlation. If Plato was describing the disasters that befell Athens or Corinth, why did he attribute his story to Egyptian priests? Certainly, his contemporaries could have thought of narrating a destructive earthquake in Athens or Corinth, especially if that earthquake had occurred only 10 or 20 years earlier. In this case, it seems there is still a missing piece among the sources Plato used for his story. The most recent theory about the location of Atlantis was proposed in 2004 by Dr. Rainer Kuhn from the University of Wuppertal in Germany. Using satellite images, Kuhn identified a region in southwestern Spain, near the city of Cadiz, with features that align with Plato's description of Atlantis. Photos of a salt marsh called Marisma de Hinojos show remnants of two rectangular structures and possibly parts of concentric circles that might have once surrounded them. According to Dr. Kuhn, These rectangular structures could be remnants of a silver temple dedicated to Poseidon and a gold temple dedicated to Plato and Poseidon, just as described in Plato's dialogues. Additionally, Kuhn believes that this region was likely destroyed by a flood between 800 to 500 BC. Building on the idea that Greek sources may have confused a word in the Egyptian language meaning a coastal strip with another word meaning an island while translating the story, he argues that Atlantis is not on an island but on the mainland. Dr. Kuhn aims to conduct excavation work in this area in the near future to test his theories. Will these excavations in the region just beyond the Pillars of Hercules finally unveil the mystery of Atlantis? 3. Ramses. In the writings commissioned by Ramses III, it is narrated that the Atlanteans originated from the landmass and islands above the Great Water Circle, from the edge of the world, descending from the ninth generation. The ninth generation corresponds to a region between the 52nd and 57th north latitudes, according to the geographical divisions used in ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. The renowned historian Renan, surprisingly claiming that there was no youth period in Egyptian art, expressed his doubts about Egyptian civilization as follows. Egypt seems as if this country has never experienced a youth period, appearing mature, old, and completely devoid of mythological and heroic ages from the very beginning. There is no infancy in Egyptian civilization, and its art has no ancient period. Egyptian civilization was mature even then. Herodotus also mentions in his work, Euterpe, that the written history of Egyptian priests dates back to 12,000 years before his time, reaching the time of the sinking of Atlantis. The Sion walls, constructed 5,400 years ago in the period when the city of Sion in Egypt exactly coincided with the Tropic of Cancer, were designed to reflect the complete disk of the sun over these walls at noon during the summer solstice. Historian Keneally states in his work, A History of the World, that even if all European scientists were to come together today, they would not be able to replicate something similar. According to Plutarch, the priest who spoke to Solon in the city of Say was named Sonches. According to Clemens of Alexandria, this is also the name of the Egyptian priest who taught Pythagoras. Plato is related to both Critias and Solon. Moreover, he visited Egypt, lived there for several years, and was initiated. Therefore, some Atlantologists believe that he gathered information on the topic of Atlantis before writing about it. According to Plato, this continent was very wealthy and ruled by noble people. It was submerged in the waters of the ocean as a result of a catastrophe. In the Quran, it is mentioned as the Ad tribe, Ad land. In northern languages, it means the land of Ad. According to some researchers, there might be an etymological connection between the name of the Ad tribe and words like Adam in Hebrew, Ad-I in Sanskrit, Attis in Phrygian, Adige among Caucasians, Atea in Polynesia, Ate in the Trojan story, Atzlan in Aztec mythology, and Ad, Ada, Ada in Turkish. James Churchward stated that Atlantis was a colony of the legendary Mu civilization. Having served as an officer in the British Army in Tibet, he later traveled the world and conducted research. In 1883, James Churchward uncovered some of the most important documents in a monastery in western Tibet. While stationed in Tibet, Churchward explored monasteries in line with his research on the origins of ancient religions. During his travels, he ended up in a monastery in western Tibet, where the chief priest Rishi, a prominent member of the Great Brotherhood of Priests, showed Churchward the Nikal tablets, written 15,000 years ago. So where is this Atlantis? Did Atlantis really exist? If there really was such a continent and city, where was it? You will soon learn the answers to all these questions. Some ancient writers viewed Atlantis as fictional or metaphorical myth. Others believed it to be real. Aristotle believed that Plato, his teacher, had invented the island to teach philosophy. The philosopher Crantor, a student of Plato's student Xenocrates, is cited often as an example of a writer who thought the story to be historical fact. His work, a commentary on Timaeus, is lost, but Proclus, a Neoplatonist of the 5th century AD, reports on it. The passage in question has been represented in the modern literature either as claiming that Crantor visited Egypt, had conversations with priests, and saw hieroglyphs confirming the story, or as claiming that he learned about them from other visitors to Egypt. Proclus wrote, "As for the whole of this account of the Atlanteans, some say that it is unadorned history, such as Crantor, the first commentator on Plato." Crantor also says that Plato's contemporaries used to criticize him jokingly for not being the inventor of his republic but copying the institutions of the Egyptians. Plato took these critics seriously enough to assign to the Egyptians this story about the Athenians and Atlanteans, so as to make them say that the Athenians really once lived according to that system. The next sentence is often translated, Crantor adds, that this is testified by the prophets of the Egyptians, who assert that these particulars are written on pillars which are still preserved. But in the original, the sentence starts not with the name Crantor but with the ambiguous he. Whether this referred to Crantor or to Plato is the subject of considerable debate. Proponents of both Atlantis as a metaphorical myth and Atlantis as history have argued that the pronoun refers to Crantor. Alan Cameron argues that the pronoun should be interpreted as referring to Plato, and that, when Proclus writes that, "We must bear in mind concerning this whole feat of the Athenians, that it is neither a mere myth nor unadorned history, although some take it as history and others as myth." He is treating Crantor's view as mere personal opinion, nothing more. In fact, he first quotes and then dismisses it as representing one of the two unacceptable extremes. Cameron also points out that whether he refers to Plato or to Crantor, the statement does not support conclusions such as Otto Muck's, Crantor came to say and saw there in the temple of Neith the column, completely covered with hieroglyphs, on which the history of Atlantis was recorded. Scholars translated it for him, and he testified that their account fully agreed with Plato's account of Atlantis, or J. V. Luce's suggestion that Crantor sent a special enquiry to Egypt, and that he may simply be referring to Plato's own claims. Another passage from the commentary by Proclus on the Timaeus gives a description of the geography of Atlantis. That an island of such nature and size once existed is evident from what is said by certain authors who investigated the things around the outer sea. For according to them, there were 7 islands in that sea in their time, sacred to Persephone, and also 3 others of enormous size, one of which was sacred to Hades, another to Ammon, and another one between them to Poseidon, the extent of which was 1,000 stadia. And the inhabitants of it, they add, preserved the remembrance from their ancestors of the immeasurably large island of Atlantis which had really existed there and which for many ages had reigned over all islands in the Atlantic Sea and which itself had likewise been sacred to Poseidon. Now these things Marcellus has written in his Ethiopica. Marcellus remains unidentified. Other ancient historians and philosophers who believed in the existence of Atlantis were Strabo and Posidonius. Some have theorized that, before the 6th century BC, the Pillars of Hercules may have applied to mountains on either side of the Gulf of Laconia, and also may have been part of the pillar cult of the Aegean. The mountains stood at either side of the southernmost gulf in Greece, the largest in the Peloponnese, and it opens onto the Mediterranean Sea. This would have placed Atlantis in the Mediterranean, lending credence to many details in Plato's discussion. The 4th century historian Ammianus Marcellinus, relying on a lost work by Timagenes, a historian writing in the 1st century BC, writes that the Druids of Gaul said that part of the inhabitants of Gaul had migrated there from distant islands. Some have understood Ammianus's testimony as a claim that at the time of Atlantis's sinking into the sea, its inhabitants fled to Western Europe. But Ammianus, in fact, says that the Dracidi recall that a part of the population is indigenous but others also migrated in from islands and lands beyond the Rhine, an indication that the immigrants came to Gaul from the north, not from a theorized location in the Atlantic Ocean to the southwest. Instead, the Celts who dwelled along the ocean were reported to venerate twin gods, who appeared to them coming from that ocean. Critias, according to Critias, the Hellenic deities of old divided the land so that each deity might have their own lot. Poseidon was appropriately, and to his liking, bequeathed the island of Atlantis. The island was larger than ancient Libya and Asia Minor combined, but it was later sunk by an earthquake and became an impassable mud shoal, inhibiting travel to any part of the ocean. Plato asserted that the Egyptians described Atlantis as an island consisting mostly of mountains in the northern portions and along the shore and encompassing a great plain in an oblong shape in the south, extending in one direction 3,000 stadia, but across the center inland it was 2,000 stadia. 50 stadia from the coast was a mountain that was low on all sides, broke it off all round about. The central island itself was 5 stades in diameter. In Plato's metaphorical tale, Poseidon fell in love with Cleito, the daughter of Evenor and Leucippe, who bore him 5 pairs of male twins. The eldest of these, Atlas, was made rightful king of the entire island and the ocean, and was given the mountain of his birth and the surrounding area as his fiefdom. Atlas's twin Gadeirus, or Eumelus in Greek, was given the extremity of the island toward the Pillars of Hercules. The other 4 pairs of twins, Amphirs and Avaemon, Nisius and Autochthon, Elasippus and Mestor, and Azaz and Diapreps, were also given rule over many men and a large territory. Poseidon carved the mountain where his love dwelt into a palace and enclosed it with 3 circular moats of increasing width, varying from 1 to 3 stadia and separated by rings of land proportional in size. The Atlanteans then built bridges northward from the mountain, making a route to the rest of the island. They dug a great canal to the sea, and alongside the bridges carved tunnels into the rings of rock so that ships could pass into the city around the mountain. They carved docks from the rock walls of the moats. Every passage to the city was guarded by gates and towers, and a wall surrounded each ring of the city. The walls were constructed of red, white, and black rock, quarried from the moats, and were covered with brass, tin, and the precious metal orichalcum, respectively. According to Critias, 9,000 years before his lifetime a war took place between those outside the Pillars of Hercules at the Strait of Gibraltar and those who dwelt within them. The Atlanteans had conquered the parts of Libya within the Pillars of Hercules, as far as Egypt, and the European continent as far as Tyrrhenia, and had subjected its people to slavery. The Athenians led an alliance of resistors against the Atlantean Empire, and as the alliance disintegrated, prevailed alone against the empire, liberating the occupied lands. But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea. For which reason the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is a shoal of mud in the way. And this was caused by the subsidence of the island. The logographer Hellanicus of Lesbos wrote an earlier work entitled Atlantis, of which only a few fragments survive. Hellanicus's work appears to have been a genealogical one concerning the daughters of Atlas, but some authors have suggested a possible connection with Plato's island. John V. Luce notes that when Plato writes about the genealogy of Atlantis's kings, he writes in the same style as Hellanicus, suggesting a similarity between a fragment of Hellanicus's work and an account in the Critias. Rodney Castledon suggests that Plato may have borrowed his title from Hellanicus, who may have based his work on an earlier work about Atlantis. Castledon has pointed out that Plato wrote of Atlantis in 359 BC, when he returned to Athens from Sicily. He notes a number of parallels between the physical organization and fortifications of Syracuse and Plato's description of Atlantis. Gunnar Rudberg was the first who elaborated upon the idea that Plato's attempt to realize his political ideas in the city of Syracuse could have heavily inspired the Atlantis account. Jewish and Christian during the early 1st century, the Hellenistic Jewish philosopher Philo wrote about the destruction of Atlantis in his On the Eternity of the World, XXVI 141, in a longer passage allegedly citing Aristotle's successor Theophrastus. And the island of Atalantes, which was greater than Africa and Asia, as Plato says in the Timaeus, in one day and night was overwhelmed beneath the sea in consequence of an extraordinary earthquake and inundation and suddenly disappeared, becoming sea, not indeed navigable, but full of gulfs and eddies. The theologian Joseph Barber Lightfoot noted on this passage, Clement may possibly be referring to some known, but hardly accessible land, lying without the Pillars of Hercules. But more probably he contemplated some unknown land in the far west beyond the ocean, like the fabled Atlantis of Plato. Other early Christian writers wrote about Atlantis, although they had mixed views on whether it once existed or was an untrustworthy myth of pagan origin. Tertullian believed Atlantis was once real and wrote that in the Atlantic Ocean once existed, that was equal in size to Libya or Asia, referring to Plato's geographical description of Atlantis. The early Christian apologist writer Arnobius also believed Atlantis once existed, but blamed its destruction on pagans. Cosmas Indicopleustes in the 6th century wrote of Atlantis in his Christian topography in an attempt to prove his theory that the world was flat and surrounded by water. In like manner, the philosopher Timaeus also describes this earth as surrounded by the ocean, and the ocean as surrounded by the more remote earth. For he supposes that there is to westward an island, Atlantis, lying out in the ocean, in the direction of Gadara, of an enormous magnitude, and relates that the 10 kings having procured mercenaries from the nations in this island came from the earth far away, and conquered Europe and Asia, but were afterwards conquered by the Athenians, while that island itself was submerged by God under the sea. Both Plato and Aristotle praise this philosopher, and Proclus has written a commentary on him. He himself expresses views similar to our own with some modifications, transferring the scene of the events from the east to the west. Moreover, he mentions those 10 generations as well as that earth which lies beyond the ocean. And in a word, it is evident that all of them borrow from Moses, and publish his statements as their own. Atlantis is a fictional island mentioned in Plato's works Timaeus and Critias as part of an allegory on the hubris of nations. In the story, Atlantis is described as a naval empire that ruled all western parts of the known world, making it the literary counter-image of the Achaemenid Empire. After an ill-fated attempt to conquer ancient Athens, Atlantis falls out of favor with the deities and submerges into the Atlantic Ocean. Since Plato describes Athens as resembling his ideal state in the Republic, the Atlantis story is meant to bear witness to the superiority of his concept of a state. Despite its minor importance in Plato's work, the Atlantis story has had a considerable impact on literature. The allegorical aspect of Atlantis was taken up in utopian works of several Renaissance writers, such as Francis Bacon's New Atlantis and Thomas More's Utopia. On the other hand, 19th-century amateur scholars misinterpreted Plato's narrative as historical tradition, most famously Ignatius L. Donnelly in his Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Plato's vague indications of the time of the events and the alleged location of Atlantis gave rise to much pseudoscientific speculation. As a consequence, Atlantis has become a byword for any and all supposed advanced prehistoric lost civilizations and continues to inspire contemporary fiction, from comic books to films. While present-day philologists and classicists agree on the story's fictional nature, there is still debate on what served as its inspiration. Plato is known to have freely borrowed some of his allegories and metaphors from older traditions, as he did with the story of Aegus. This led a number of scholars to suggest possible inspiration of Atlantis from Egyptian records of the Thera eruption, the Sea People's invasion, or the Trojan War. Others have rejected this chain of tradition as implausible and insist that Plato created an entirely fictional account, drawing loose inspiration from contemporary events such as the failed Athenian invasion of Sicily in 415 to 413 BC or the destruction of Helike in 373 BC. Plato's dialogues. The only primary sources for Atlantis are Plato's dialogues Timaeus and Critias. All other mentions of the island are based on them. The dialogues claim to quote Solon, who visited Egypt between 590 and 580 BC. They state that he translated Egyptian records of Atlantis. Plato introduced Atlantis in Timaeus, written in 360 BC. For it is related in our records how once upon a time your state stayed the course of a mighty host, which, starting from a distant point in the Atlantic Ocean, was insolently advancing to attack the whole of Europe, and Asia to boot. For the ocean there was at that time navigable. For in front of the mouth which you Greeks call, as you say, the Pillars of Heracles, there lay an island which was larger than Libya and Asia together. And it was possible for the travelers of that time to cross from it to the other islands, and from the islands to the whole of the continent over against them which encompasses that veritable ocean. For all that we have here, lying within the mouth of which we speak, is evidently a haven having a narrow entrance. But that yonder is a real ocean, and the land surrounding it may most rightly be called, in the fullest and truest sense, a continent. Now in this island of Atlantis there existed a confederation of kings, of great and marvelous power, which held sway over all the island, and over many other islands also in parts of the continent. The four people appearing in those two dialogues are the politicians Critias and Hermocrates as well as the philosophers Socrates and Timaeus of Locri, although only Critias speaks of Atlantis. In his works, Plato makes extensive use of the Socratic method in order to discuss contrary positions within the context of a supposition. The Timaeus begins with an introduction, followed by an account of the creations and structure of the universe and ancient civilizations. In the introduction, Socrates muses about the perfect society, described in Plato's Republic, and wonders if he and his guests might recollect a story which exemplifies such a society. Critias mentions a tale he considered to be historical, that would make the perfect example, and he then follows by describing Atlantis as is recorded in the Critias. In his account, ancient Athens seems to represent the perfect society, and Atlantis its opponent, representing the very antithesis of the perfect traits described in the Republic. Aside from Plato's original account, modern interpretations regarding Atlantis are an amalgamation of diverse, speculative movements that began in the 16th century, when scholars began to identify Atlantis with the New World. Francisco López de Gomara was the first to state that Plato was referring to America, as did Francis Bacon and Alexander von Humboldt. Janus Joannes Burchard said in 1663, Orb novo non novo. Athanasius Kircher accepted Plato's account as literally true, describing Atlantis as a small continent in the Atlantic Ocean. Contemporary perceptions of Atlantis share roots with Mayanism, which can be traced to the beginning of the modern age, when European imaginations were fueled by their initial encounters with the indigenous peoples of the Americas. From this era sprang apocalyptic and utopian visions that would inspire many subsequent generations of theorists. Most of these interpretations are considered pseudo-history, pseudoscience, or pseudo-archaeology, as they have presented their works as academic or scientific, but lack the standards or criteria. The Flemish cartographer and geographer Abraham Ortelius is believed to have been the first person to imagine that the continents were joined before drifting to their present positions. In the 1596 edition of his Thesaurus Geographicus he wrote, "Unless it be a fable, the island of Gadir or Gades will be the remaining part of the island of Atlantis or America, which was not sunk so much as torn away from Europe and Africa by earthquakes and flood." The traces of the ruptures are shown by the projections of Europe and Africa and the indentations of America in the parts of the coasts of these three said lands that face each other to anyone who, using a map of the world, carefully considered them. So that anyone may say with Strabo in Book 2, that what Plato says of the island of Atlantis on the authority of Solon is not a figment. Early influential literature, the term utopia, was coined by Sir Thomas More in his 16th-century work of fiction Utopia. Inspired by Plato's Atlantis and travelers' accounts of the Americas, More described an imaginary land set in the New World. His idealistic vision established a connection between the Americas and utopian societies, a theme that Bacon discussed in The New Atlantis. A character in the narrative gives a history of Atlantis that is similar to Plato's and places Atlantis in America. People had begun believing that the Mayan and Aztec ruins could possibly be the remnants of Atlantis. Impact of Mayanism. Much speculation began as to the origins of the Maya, which led to a variety of narratives and publications that tried to rationalize the discoveries within the context of the Bible and that had undertones of racism in their connections between the Old and New World. The Europeans believed the indigenous people to be inferior and incapable of building that which was now in ruins, and by sharing a common history, they insinuated that another race must have been responsible. In the middle and late 19th century, several renowned Mesoamerican scholars, starting with Charles Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg, and including Edward Herbert Thompson and Augustus Le Plongeon, formally proposed that Atlantis was somehow related to Mayan and Aztec culture. The French scholar Brasseur de Bourbourg traveled extensively through Mesoamerica in the mid-1800s, and was renowned for his translations of Mayan texts, most notably the sacred book Popol Vuh, as well as a comprehensive history of the region. Soon after these publications, however, Brasseur de Bourbourg lost his academic credibility, due to his claim that the Maya peoples had descended from the Toltecs, people he believed were the surviving population of the racially superior civilization of Atlantis. His work, combined with the skillful, romantic illustrations of Jean-Frédéric Waldeck, which visually alluded to Egypt and other aspects of the Old World, created an authoritative fantasy that excited much interest in the connections between worlds. Inspired by Brasseur de Bourbourg's diffusion theories, the pseudo-archaeologist Augustus Le Plongeon traveled to Mesoamerica and performed some of the first excavations of many famous Mayan ruins. Le Plongeon invented narratives, such as the Kingdom of Mu saga, which romantically drew connections to him, his wife Alice, and Egyptian deities Osiris and Isis, as well as to Heinrich Schliemann, who had just discovered the ancient city of Troy from Homer's epic poetry. He also believed that he had found connections between the Greek and Mayan languages, which produced a narrative of the destruction of Atlantis. Ignatius Donnelly, the 1882 publication of Atlantis, The Antediluvian World by Ignatius L. Donnelly, stimulated much popular interest in Atlantis. He was greatly inspired by early works in Mayanism, and like them, attempted to establish that all known ancient civilizations were descended from Atlantis, which he saw as a technologically sophisticated, more advanced culture. Donnelly drew parallels between creation stories in the Old and New worlds, attributing the connections to Atlantis, where he believed the biblical Garden of Eden existed. As implied by the title of his book, he also believed that Atlantis was destroyed by the Great Flood mentioned in the Bible. Donnelly is credited as the father of the 19th century Atlantis Revival, and is the reason the myth endures today. He unintentionally promoted an alternative method of inquiry to history and science, and the idea that myths contain hidden information that opens them to ingenious interpretation by people who believe they have new or special insight. Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophists Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophists, took up Donnelly's interpretations when she wrote The Secret Doctrine, which she claimed was originally dictated in Atlantis. She maintained that the Atlanteans were cultural heroes. She believed in a form of racial evolution. In her process of evolution, the Atlanteans were the fourth root race, which were succeeded by the fifth, the Aryan race, which she identified with the modern human race. In her book, Blavatsky reported that the civilization of Atlantis reached its peak between 1 million and 900,000 years ago, but destroyed itself through internal warfare brought about by the dangerous use of psychic and supernatural powers of the inhabitants. Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy and Waldorf schools, along with other well-known theosophists, such as Annie Besant, also wrote of cultural evolution in much the same vein. Other occultists followed the same lead, at least to the point of tracing the lineage of occult practices back to Atlantis. Among the most famous is Diane Fortune in her esoteric orders and their work. Drawing on the ideas of Rudolf Steiner and Hans Horbiger, Egon Friedel started his book Kulturgeschichte des Altertums, and thus his historical analysis of antiquity, with the ancient culture of Atlantis. The book was published in 1940. Nazism and occultism. See also Nazism and occultism. Blavatsky was also inspired by the work of the 18th century astronomer Jean-Sylvain Bailly, who had orientalized the Atlantis myth in his mythical continent of Hyperborea, a reference to Greek myths featuring a northern European region of the same name, home to a giant, godlike race. Dan Edelstein claims that her reshaping of this theory in The Secret Doctrine provided the Nazis with a mythological precedent and a pretext for their ideological platform and their subsequent genocide. However, Blavatsky's writings mention that the Atlantean were in fact olive-skinned peoples with Mongoloid traits who were the ancestors of modern Native Americans, Mongolians, and Malayans. The idea that the Atlanteans were Hyperborean, Nordic supermen who originated in the northern Atlantic or even in the far north, was popular in the German Ariosophic movement around 1900, propagated by Guido von List and others. It gave its name to the Thule Gesellschaft, an anti-Semite Munich lodge, which preceded the German Nazi Party. The scholars Carl Georg Schach and Hermann Wirth were the first to speak of a Nordic Atlantean, or Aryan Nordic, master race that spread from Atlantis over the northern hemisphere and beyond. The Hyperboreans were contrasted with the Jewish people. Party ideologist Alfred Rosenberg and sulfur monosulfide leader Heinrich Himmler made it part of the official doctrine. The idea was followed up by the adherents of esoteric Nazism such as Julius Evola and, more recently, Miguel Serrano. The idea of Atlantis as the homeland of the Caucasian race would contradict the beliefs of older esoteric and theosophic groups, which taught that the Atlanteans were non-Caucasian brown-skinned peoples. Modern esoteric groups, including the Theosophic Society, do not consider Atlantean society to have been superior or utopian. They rather consider it a lower stage of evolution. Edgar Cayce, the clairvoyant Edgar Cayce, spoke frequently of Atlantis. During his life readings, he claimed that many of his subjects were reincarnations of people who had lived there. By tapping into their collective consciousness, the Akashic records, Casey declared that he was able to give detailed descriptions of the lost continent. He also asserted that Atlantis would rise again in the 1960s and that there is a hall of records beneath the Egyptian Sphinx which holds the historical texts of Atlantis. Recent times as continental drift became widely accepted during the 1960s, and the increased understanding of plate tectonics demonstrated the impossibility of a lost continent in the geologically recent past. Most lost continent theories of Atlantis began to wane in popularity. Plato scholar Julia Annas, Regents Professor of Philosophy at the University of Arizona, had this to say on the matter. The continuing industry of discovering Atlantis illustrates the dangers of reading Plato. For he is clearly using what has become a standard device of fiction, stressing the historicity of an event as an indication that what follows is fiction. The idea is that we should use the story to examine our ideas of government and power. We have missed the point if instead of thinking about these issues we go off exploring the seabed. The continuing misunderstanding of Plato as historian here enables us to see why his distrust of imaginative writing is sometimes justified. One of the proposed explanations for the historical context of the Atlantis story is that it serves as Plato's warning to his fellow citizens against their striving for naval power. Kenneth Feder points out that Critias's story in the Timaeus provides a major clue. In the dialogue, Critias says, referring to Socrates' hypothetical society, "And when you were speaking yesterday about your city and citizens, the tale which I have just been repeating to you came into my mind, and I remarked with astonishment how, by some mysterious coincidence, you agreed in almost every particular with the narrative of Solon." Feder quotes A. E. Taylor, who wrote, "We could not be told much more plainly that the whole narrative of Solon's conversation with the priests and his intention of writing the poem about Atlantis are an invention of Plato's fancy." Location hypotheses. Since Donnelly's day, there have been dozens of locations proposed for Atlantis, to the point where the name has become a generic concept, divorced from the specifics of Plato's account. This is reflected in the fact that many proposed sites are not within the Atlantic at all. Few today are scholarly or archaeological hypotheses, while others have been made by psychic or other pseudoscientific means. Many of the proposed sites share some of the characteristics of the Atlantis story, but none has been demonstrated to be a true historical Atlantis. In or near the Mediterranean Sea. Most of the historically proposed locations are in or near the Mediterranean Sea. Islands such as Sardinia, Crete, Santorini, Sicily, Cyprus, and Malta. Land-based cities or states such as Troy, Tartessos, and Tantalus. Israel, Sinai or Canaan, and northwestern Africa, including the Rechat structure in Mauritania. The Thera eruption, dated to the 17th or 16th century BC, caused a large tsunami that some experts hypothesize devastated the Minoan civilization on the nearby island of Crete, further leading some to believe that this may have been the catastrophe that inspired the story. In the area of the Black Sea, the following locations have been proposed: Bosporus and Ancona. Others have noted that, before the 6th century BC, the mountains on either side of the Laconian Gulf were called the Pillars of Hercules, and they could be the geographical location being described in ancient reports upon which Plato was basing his story. The mountains stood at either side of the southernmost gulf in Greece, the largest in the Peloponnese, and that gulf opens onto the Mediterranean Sea. If from the beginning of discussions, misinterpretation of Gibraltar as the location rather than being at the Gulf of Laconia would lend itself to many erroneous concepts regarding the location of Atlantis. Plato may have not been aware of the difference. The Laconian pillars open to the south toward Crete and beyond which is Egypt. The Thera eruption and the Late Bronze Age collapse affected that area and might have been the devastation to which the sources used by Plato referred. Significant events such as these would have been likely material for tales passed from one generation to another for almost 1,000 years. In the Atlantic Ocean, the location of Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean has a certain appeal given the closely related names. Popular culture often places Atlantis there, perpetuating the original Platonic setting as they understand it. The Canary Islands and Madeira Islands have been identified as a possible location, west of the Straits of Gibraltar, but in relative proximity to the Mediterranean Sea. Detailed studies of their geomorphology and geology have demonstrated, however, that they have been steadily uplifted, without any significant periods of subsidence, over the last 4 million years, by geologic processes such as erosional unloading, gravitational unloading, lithospheric flexure induced by adjacent islands, and volcanic underplating. Various islands or island groups in the Atlantic were also identified as possible locations, notably the Azores. Similarly, cores of sediment covering the ocean bottom surrounding the Azores and other evidence demonstrate that it has been an undersea plateau for millions of years. The area is known for its volcanism, however, which is associated with rifting along the Azores Triple Junction. The spread of the crust along the existing faults and fractures has produced many volcanic and seismic events. The area is supported by a buoyant upwelling in the deeper mantle, which some associate with an Azores hotspot. Most of the volcanic activity has occurred primarily along the Terceira Rift. From the beginning of the island settlement, around the 15th century, there have been about 30 volcanic eruptions as well as numerous, powerful earthquakes. The island of São Miguel in the Azores is the site of the Sete Cidades volcano and caldera, which are the byproducts of historical volcanic activity in the Azores. The submerged island of Spartel near the Strait of Gibraltar has also been suggested. In Europe, several hypotheses place the sunken island in northern Europe, including Doggerland in the North Sea, and Sweden. Doggerland, as well as Viking Bergen Island, is thought to have been flooded by a megatsunami following the Storegga slide of circa 6100 BC. Some have proposed the Celtic Shelf as a possible location, and that there is a link to Ireland. In 2004, Swedish physiographist Ulf Erlingsson proposed that the legend of Atlantis was based on Stone Age Ireland. He later stated that he does not believe that Atlantis ever existed but maintained that his hypothesis that its description matches Ireland's geography has a 99.8% probability. The director of the National Museum of Ireland commented that there was no archaeology supporting this. In 2011, a team, working on a documentary for the National Geographic Channel, led by Professor Richard Freund from the University of Hartford, claimed to have found possible evidence of Atlantis in southwestern Andalusia. The team identified its possible location within the marshlands of the Doñana National Park, in the area that once was the Lacus Ligustinus, between the Huelva, Cadiz, and Seville provinces, and they speculated that Atlantis had been destroyed by a tsunami, extrapolating results from a previous study by Spanish researchers, published 4 years earlier. Spanish scientists have dismissed Freund's speculations, claiming that he sensationalized their work. The anthropologist Juan Villarreal Robles, who works with the Spanish National Research Council, said, "Richard Freund was a newcomer to our project and appeared to be involved in his own very controversial issue concerning King Solomon's search for ivory and gold in Tartessos, the well-documented settlement in the Doñana area established in the 1st millennium BC, and described Freund's claims as fanciful." A similar theory had previously been put forward by a German researcher, Rainer W. Kuhn, that is based only on satellite imagery and places Atlantis in the Marismas de Hinojos, north of the city of Cadiz. Before that, The historian Adolf Schulten had stated in the 1920s that Plato had used Tartessos as the basis for his Atlantis myth. Other locations, several writers, such as Flavio Barbero as early as 1974, have speculated that Antarctica is the site of Atlantis. A number of claims involve the Caribbean, such as an alleged underwater formation off the Guanahacoibes Peninsula in Cuba. The adjacent Bahamas or the folkloric Bermuda Triangle have been proposed as well. Areas in the Pacific and Indian Oceans have also been proposed, including Indonesia. The stories of a lost continent off the coast of India, named Kumari Kandam, have inspired some to draw parallels to Atlantis. Ancient versions, in order to give his account of Atlantis verisimilitude, Plato mentions that the story was heard by Solon in Egypt, and transmitted orally over several generations through the family of Dropides, until it reached Critias, a dialogue speaker in Timaeus and Critias. Solon had supposedly tried to adapt the Atlantis oral tradition into a poem. While it was never completed, Solon passed on the story to Dropides. Modern classicists deny the existence of Solon's Atlantis poem and the story as an oral tradition. Instead, Plato is thought to be the sole inventor or fabricator. Hellanicus of Lesbos used the word Atlantis as the title for a poem published before Plato, a fragment of which may be Oxyrhynchus Papyrus 11, 1359. This work only describes the Atlantides, the daughters of Atlas, and has no relation to Plato's Atlantis account. In the New Era, the 3rd century AD Neoplatonist Zodicus wrote an epic poem based on Plato's account of Atlantis. Plato's work may already have inspired parodic imitation, however. Writing only a few decades after the Timaeus and Critias, the historian Theopompus of Chios wrote of a land beyond the ocean known as Meropis. This description was included in Book 8 of his Philippica, which contains a dialogue between Silenus and King Midas. Silenus describes the Meropids, a race of men who grow to twice normal size, and inhabit 2 cities on the island of Meropis, Eusebes and Makamos. He also reports that an army of 10 million soldiers crossed the ocean to conquer Hyperborea, but abandoned this proposal when they realized that the Hyperboreans were the luckiest people on Earth. Heinz Gunther Nesselrath has argued that these and other details of Silenus' story are meant as imitation and exaggeration of the Atlantis story, by parody, for the purpose of exposing Plato's ideas to ridicule. Utopias and dystopias. The creation of utopian and dystopian fictions was renewed after the Renaissance, most notably in Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, the description of an ideal society that he located off the western coast of America. Thomas Hayrick followed him with The New Atlantis, a satirical poem in 3 parts. His new continent of uncertain location, perhaps even a floating island either in the sea or the sky, serves as background for his exposure of what he described in a second edition as a true character of Popery and Jesuitism. The title of The New Atalantis by de la Rivière Manley, distinguished from the 2 others by the single letter, is an equally dystopian work but set this time on a fictional Mediterranean island. In it, sexual violence and exploitation is made a metaphor for the hypocritical behavior of politicians in their dealings with the general public. In Manley's case, the target of satire was the Whig Party, while in David MacLean Perry's The Scarlet Empire, it is socialism as practiced in foundered Atlantis. It was followed in Russia by Velimir Klebanov's poem The Fall of Atlantis, which is set in a future rationalist dystopia that has discovered the secret of immortality and is so dedicated to progress that it has lost touch with the past. When the high priest of this ideology is tempted by a slave girl into an act of irrationality, he murders her and precipitates a second flood, above which her severed head floats vengefully among the stars. A slightly later work, The Ancient of Atlantis by Albert Armstrong Manship, expounds the Atlantean wisdom that is to redeem the earth. Its 3 parts consist of a verse narrative of the life and training of an Atlantean wise one, followed by his utopian moral teachings, and then a psychic drama set in modern times in which a reincarnated child embodying the lost wisdom is reborn on Earth. In Hispanic eyes, Atlantis had a more intimate interpretation. The land had been a colonial power which, although it had brought civilization to ancient Europe, had also enslaved its peoples. Its tyrannical fall from grace had contributed to the fate that had overtaken it, but now its disappearance had unbalanced the world. This was the point of view of Jacinth Verdaguer's vast mythological epic L'Atlantida. After the sinking of the former continent, Hercules travels east across the Atlantic to found the city of Barcelona and then departs westward again to the Hesperides. The story is told by a hermit to a shipwrecked mariner, who is inspired to follow in his tracks and so call the new world into existence to redress the balance of the old. This mariner, of course, was Christopher Columbus. Verdaguer's poem was written in Catalan, but was widely translated in both Europe and Hispano-America. One response was the similarly entitled Argentinian Atlantida of Olegario Victor Andrade, which sees in enchanted Atlantis that Plato foresaw, a golden promise to the fruitful race of Latins. The bad example of the colonizing world remains, however. José Juan Tablada characterizes its threat in his De Atlantida, through the beguiling picture of the lost world populated by the underwater creatures of classical myth, among whom is the siren of its final stanza with her eye on the keel of the wandering vessel that in passing deflowers the sea's smooth mirror, launching into the night her amorous warbling and the dulcet lullaby of her treacherous voice. There is a similar ambivalence in Janis Johuis's 6th stanza, Atlantis, where a celebration of the Faroese linguistic revival grants it an ancient pedigree by linking Greek to Norse legend. In the poem, a female figure rising from the sea against a background of classical palaces is recognized as a priestess of Atlantis. The poet recalls that the Faroes lie there in the North Atlantic Ocean, where before lay the poet dreamt lands, but also that in Norse belief, such a figure only appears to those about to drown. A land lost in the distance. The fact that Atlantis is a lost land has made of it a metaphor for something no longer attainable. For the American poet Edith Willis Lynn Forbes, the lost Atlantis stands for idealization of the past. The present moment can only be treasured once that is realized. Ella Wheeler Wilcox finds the location of the lost land in one's carefree youthful past. Similarly, for the Irish poet Evan Boland in Atlantis, a lost sonnet, the idea was defined when the old fable makers searched hard for a word to convey that what is gone forever. For some male poets too, the idea of Atlantis is constructed from what cannot be obtained. Charles Bewley in his Newdigate Prize poem thinks it grows from dissatisfaction with one's condition, and, because life is partly sweet and ever girt about with pain, we take the sweetness, and are fain to set it free from grief's alloy in a dream of Atlantis. Similarly for the Australian Gary Catalano in a 1982 prose poem, it is a vision that sank under the weight of its own perfection. W. H. Auden, however, suggests a way out of such frustration through the metaphor of journeying toward Atlantis in his poem of 1941. While traveling, he advises the one setting out, "You will meet with many definitions of the goal in view, only realizing at the end that the way has all the time led inward." Epic narratives, a few late 19th century verse narratives, complement the genre fiction that was beginning to be written at the same period. Two of them report the disaster that overtook the continent as related by long-lived survivors. In Frederick Tennyson's Atlantis, an ancient Greek mariner sails west and discovers an inhabited island which is all that remains of the former kingdom. He learns of its end and views the shattered remnant of its former glory, from which a few had escaped to set up the Mediterranean civilizations. In the second, Mona, Queen of Lost Atlantis, an idyllic re-embodiment of long-forgotten history by James Logue Dryden, the story is told in a series of visions. A seer is taken to Mona's burial chamber in the ruins of Atlantis, where she revives and describes the catastrophe. There follows a survey of the lost civilizations of Hyperborea and Lemuria as well as Atlantis, accompanied by much spiritualist lore. William Walton Hoskins admits to the readers of his Atlantis and other poems that he is only 24. Its melodramatic plot concerns the poisoning of the descendant of God-born kings. The usurping poisoner is poisoned in his turn, following which the continent is swallowed in the waves. Asian Gods People the Landscape of the Lost Island by Edward Taylor Fletcher. An angel foresees impending catastrophe and that the people will be allowed to escape if their semi-divine rulers will sacrifice themselves. A final example, Edward N. Beecher's The Lost Atlantis or The Great Deluge of All is just a doggerel vehicle for its author's opinions. That the continent was the location of the Garden of Eden. That Darwin's theory of evolution is correct, as are Donnelly's views. Atlantis was to become a theme in Russia following the 1890s, taken up in unfinished poems by Valery Bryasov and Konstantin Balmont, as well as in a drama by the schoolgirl Larissa Reisner. One other long narrative poem was published in New York by George V. Golikvastov. His 250-page The Fall of Atlantis records how a high priest, distressed by the prevailing degeneracy of the ruling classes, seeks to create an androgynous being from royal twins as a means to overcome this polarity. When he is unable to control the forces unleashed by his occult ceremony, the continent is destroyed. Painting and sculpture paintings of the submersion of Atlantis are comparatively rare. In the 17th century there was François de Nomé's The Fall of Atlantis, which shows a tidal wave surging toward a Baroque city frontage. The style of architecture apart, it is not very different from Nicholas Rerich's The Last of Atlantis of 1928. The most dramatic depiction of the catastrophe was Léon Bach's Ancient Terror, although it does not name Atlantis directly. It is a mountain-top view of a rocky bay breached by the sea, which is washing inland about the tall structures of an ancient city. A streak of lightning crosses the upper half of the painting, while below it rises the impassive figure of an enigmatic goddess who holds a blue dove between her breasts. Vyacheslav Ivanov identified the subject as Atlantis in a public lecture on the painting given in 1909, the year it was first exhibited, and he has been followed by other commentators in the years since. Sculptures referencing Atlantis have often been stylized single figures. One of the earliest was Einar Jonsson's The King of Atlantis, now in the garden of his museum in Reykjavik. It represents a single figure, clad in a belted skirt and wearing a large triangular helmet, who sits on an ornate throne supported between two young bulls. The walking female entitled Atlantis by Ivan Mestrovic was from a series inspired by ancient Greek figures with the symbolical meaning of unjustified suffering. In the case of the Brussels fountain feature known as the Man of Atlantis by the Belgian sculptor Luc van Soom, the 4-meter-tall figure wearing a diving suit steps from a plinth into the spray. It looks light-hearted, but the artist's comment on it makes a serious point. Because habitable land will be scarce, it is no longer improbable that we will return to the water in the long term. As a result, a portion of the population will mutate into fish-like creatures. Global warming and rising water levels are practical problems for the world in general and here in the Netherlands in particular. Robert Smithson's hypothetical continent, map of broken clear glass, Atlantis was first created as a photographical project in Loveladies, New Jersey, in 1969, and then recreated as a gallery installation of broken glass. On this he commented that he liked landscapes that suggest prehistory. And this is borne out by the original conceptual drawing of the work that includes an inset map of the continent sited off the coast of Africa and at the straits into the Mediterranean.